Chapter 14 of The Cruise of the Falcon by E. F. Knight. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The Montes of Santiago. March 23rd. Having closed the ball, we saddled our horses and resumed our journey. I am afraid that some of our guests could easily have been taken for Anglo-Saxons this morning, for, unfairly enough, anyone at all disguised in drink is at once put down as one of that bibulous race by the South American. Our gin, too, was strong, and to tell the truth vile, but the beverages supplied at balls are not proverbially of the best quality even in England. A choice deputation of revelers accompanied us a good way outside the town. Then we shook hands all around, or rather 2 or 3 times all around, for the deputation was singularly short of memory. The comandante came with me with his clanging saber and his beaming face at least 6 separate times. On each occasion he came back to the attack, saying, "Ah, Don Eduardo, I have not embraced you, nor bidden you thee farewell yet. Goodbye, dear friend, goodbye." At last we broke away from the kind and friendly people and proceeded to brace ourselves up with a smart gallop after our night's dissipation. The country was now becoming poorer and more thinly inhabited as we progressed. We were approaching an almost waterless and rainless region, utterly unfit for cultivation of any kind. From dawn till the late afternoon we traveled on this day without seeing any sign of human life. We had now crossed the frontier and were in the ill-famed, poverty-stricken province of Santiago, almost a desert itself, surrounded by veritable deserts. At last we saw before us a little rancho with a corral by it, but no pasture anywhere, no plot of maize or alfalfa, or indeed any sign to show on what the inhabitants of the hovel subsisted. We rode up to it. An Indian woman with a child in her arms came out. "Have you got any charqui to sell?" we asked. "No, señor." "Any maíz?" "No, señor." "Have you any food at all in this rancho?" "No, señor." We were parched with thirst, as were our poor horses, so we asked the woman if she could supply us with some water. "I have got no water, señor," she replied. There is in the neighborhood of nearly every rancho in this part of the country a laguna, or little artificially dammed-in pond, in which stink the hot and putrescent dregs of the last rains. But the laguna here had been dried up for weeks. "Where is the nearest water, then?" we asked. "Quien sabe," was the reply. "Who knows? They say that the laguna 2 leagues further on is also dry." These people are certainly not unlike the animals they breed in many of their habits, as hardy and enduring as the beasts of the field. Often, as in this instance, a native will find himself in the dry season at many leagues' distance from the nearest water. This troubles him but very little. Notwithstanding the dry, thirst-giving nature of his diet, he can exist without drinking for days comfortably enough. Twice a week or so he will go down to water with his cattle to the nearest laguna and thence slake his thirst. How unlike the poor bibulous white man, who has such an unfortunate tendency to get thirsty at all sorts of odd moments. So we had to ride on without food or drink all day until sunset, when we reached a comfortable-looking house. A plantation of prickly pears and a plot of alfalfa were on one side of it, a muddy pond on the other. The master came out to greet us with the usual stately politeness. He was a man of some substance, for his broad hide belt was adorned with many coins, a gold condor gleaming in the midst of them, and he wore at his back a long knife in a heavy silver sheath. He was able to supply us with as much alfalfa and water as we required, and told us that we were at liberty to sleep under the large paradise tree in front of the house. So we unsaddled our horses and placed a welcome feed of alfalfa before them, and then bethought us of our own supper, which was also not unwelcome, considering that it was our first meal this day. We had mutton for a change this night, for we purchased a plump live sheep from our host for 12 reals, about 4 shillings. We took him under our tree and made all ready for a truly Homeric repast. We lit a glorious fire, while Manuel, now quite in his element, cut the sheep's throat, deftly skinned and disemboweled it, and then hung the carcass on a branch. As we had now more than sufficient meat for 2 days, we did not care about keeping the innards, so Manuel took these in his hand, walked up to the senora of the house, bowed, doffed his hat in stately fashion, and with a neat little speech presented them to her as a small token of his gratitude for all her kindness. A don of the old Spanish court could not have presented a necklace of pearls to a great court lady with more polished courtesy than Manuel and his strings of raw tripes to the buxom Dulcinea of the Estancia Algarroba. We really appreciated our splendid roast mutton this night, unaccompanied though it was by bread or vegetables. Our host, Don Inocentia Acosta, could not supply us with these. It was, I suppose, beneath the dignity of his stock of shepherd gentleman to plant a potato. We turned in under our blankets to leeward of the fire so that smoke might keep the mosquitoes from us, for these pests were numerous this night. As we were making our preparations for the night, our host came out to us and advised us to sleep with our revolvers loaded at our sides. "For," said he, "this is a wild part of the country. Who knows what bad men may pass by tonight?" A month or 2 back, 2 young fellows who had brought some cattle to the south for sale, and were returning with the money, slept one night under that very tree where you are. The next morning we found them lying there robbed, and with their throats cut from ear to ear. However, we slept snugly by our fire under the paradise tree, undisturbed save by the dogs, who, smelling the blood of our sheep, prowled around our camp constantly. Manuel had placed the sheep's head under his own head for safety. At midnight 3 or 4 big, bold dogs crept up, made a sudden rush at him, rolled his head aside, and decamped in a moment with a delicate morsel, the sheep's, not Manuel's, head. A fearful uproar ensued, and sonorous Castilian oaths fell like a cataract from our faithful peon's mouth. We all leapt up and seized our revolvers, thinking that an Indian raid at the least was on us. On Manuel's explaining, we laughed heartily at the adventure, to his disgust, for he would not be consoled for the loss of his sheep's head. Then we rolled ourselves in our blankets, lit our pipes, and smoked ourselves to sleep once more. March 24th. At daybreak our fire was still alight, so we made some mate and cooked some appetizing kebabs of the kidneys and other choice morsels of our sheep. Then we saddled, slung the remains of the carcass over Manuel's horse, and galloped off. At an early hour in the afternoon we reached the township of Ojo del Agua, consisting of 1 large square, a church at one side of it, and about 20 mean houses scattered around. Through the broad spaces between these one perceived the wilderness, whose luxuriant growth ran through and overflowed all the square itself. Yet this is the pueblo that our last night's host spoke of as muy linda, very pretty, and possessing mucho gente. We put up at the most respectable store, where some awful-looking ruffians, gauchos of gauchos, would insist on our drinking with them. These were weather-beaten, cutthroat-looking fellows with knives ostentatiously long, montañeros, who came down to town occasionally to purchase mate or other necessaries, when, as now, they knew that there were no soldiers about. The Montes about here seem to have a very bad name. I suppose there must be some fire where there is so much smoke. Our host, rather a timid fellow, told us that these men were banditti when chance offered, prowled about the tropilla track, attacked small parties of travelers, and cut camp to unknown fastnesses when they were pursued after some more daring outrage than usual. We were warned to be careful, when camping out by night especially. The coinage in Santiago is curious in itself, and there is but little of it. I drank a glass of caña at the store and presented the smallest coin current, the silver chiroya of Bolivia, worth 2 reals. I received in exchange a little triangular bit of silver, which on inspection turned out to be the quarter of a chiroya, for here, in default of smaller change, the people cut up their coins. 2 cigars and a vale or IOU for another quarter real with a storekeeper's stamp and signature on it. The storekeepers in the remoter provinces often do this petty banking, and issue these vales to large extent in lieu of giving small change. A very good business, too, it must be for them, for not only do they thus derive the banker's ordinary profits, but indirectly others also, for the holder of the vale generally, I should imagine, feels himself rather a mean cuss when he enters the store to get it cashed, and ends by becoming ashamed of himself and taking it out in drinks or other kind instead of in specie. Our host informed us that the country ahead of us was very rough, that the old Tropea track was quite impassable, as there was no food to be found on it for man or horse for at least 80 miles, a land of rocks and deserts uninhabited and waterless, traversed only by gaucho bandits when escaping pursuit. He therefore advised us to leave this track for a time and make a detour to the eastward, so passing through the pueblo of Salarina. March 25th. The vegetation, as I have before remarked, had been gradually changing as we advanced, becoming more and more of the tropics. It reached its climax of luxuriance in the country we traversed during the next 3 days, before becoming stunted and ugly again on the borders of the salt desert we had subsequently to ride across. The coloring of the jungle seemed now of an almost unnatural brilliancy. Strange thorny shrubs, flowers, and capsicums with leaves of all shapes and hues thickly covered the ground, but nearly all were of a dazzling metallic luster, some gleaming like blue steel, others like burnished yellow gold or red copper or still darker bronze. The snakes and birds and beetles, too, that fed on the acrid juices of these seemed to have acquired from them the same mineral sheen, so brightly flashed their gorgeous wings and scales. Glorious convolvuli, with large blossoms of various colors, wound luxuriantly over every bush. One creeper, with white waxen flowers, sweet scent, and bright emerald leaves, struck us for its remarkable beauty. We procured some seed of this and sent it home. Perchance the child of Central South America will flourish in an English hothouse. The prickly pear trees, covered with delicious ripe fruit, were everywhere. This was the only food-producing plant of the Monte. Not only we ourselves, but our horses also appreciated the cool pulp when we were thirsty. Giant cacti at intervals soared above the lesser growth of the jungle. After riding some few leagues this day, we came to some open spaces in the bush, clear spots of bare dry earth, where we perceived growing in patches a low, insignificant-looking plant with soft, white-petaled flowers and leaves of vivid green. "The chuchu," said Manuel. Yes, this was the fatal plant against which we had been so frequently warned. Further on we saw acres of it. It grows only where no other living plant is, on the bare desert spots of the country, in solitude, as if all the other herbs avoid its poisonous influence, forming little bright green isles of verdure on the yellow earth. I do not know whether it be poisonous to man, but if a horse swallow but a few leaves of the deadly plant, the symptoms of violent intoxication will first be declared, and the poor beast will die within an hour, raving mad and in great agony. The fact of its growing only in pastureless districts makes it particularly dangerous. The horses that are native to the subtropical plains where it grows know it and avoid it instinctively, but strange horses, like our own from the pampas, will greedily devour it when they come across it. We had, in consequence, to look carefully after our animals, and never let them wander about to graze when any of this was near. Chuchu, by the way, not only signifies this horse-poisoning plant, but also the man-poisoning fever of Tucuman and the northern provinces. We were in luck this day, for at noon we reached a rancho called Iguya, and found that we were in time for a grand feast. An ox had been killed, a great event, so that the people of the place were making merry. Like vultures, the gauchos and others had smelt the blood from afar, and had gathered here to participate in the luxury of a feed of fresh meat. Of course, we also were invited to fall to with our fingers at the sweet asados, and to help them drain the bottle of Squareface as it went its rounds. Ultimately we departed, content and happy, for had we not enjoyed a very square meal? In the evening we reached Quebrachos, a town which, like all these pretentious Santiagan settlements, was laid out in a huge square, not by 4/5 filled up with the mud houses. At one end was a church, a curious edifice, ambitious in design, of unbaked mud, unfinished, but half fallen in. The architect had tried too much. Crumbling mud is far too unstable a material wherewith to construct a pretentious Gothic cathedral like this promised to be had it held out. The inhabitants of this bleak mud square were exceedingly hospitable. The comandante lodged us for the night, and a courteous and handsome old gentleman invited us to dinner. He was a colonel in the army, but as a follower of General Metry, the ex-president, he was out of service pro tem and in receipt of no pay. For, as I have already explained, in these enlightened and go-ahead republics, there is a clean sweep of the broom with each change of government. When one party goes, out too go all the subordinates, even down to the ticket clerks of the government railways, and even, I should not be surprised to hear, the licensed shoeblacks of the capital. The colonel was a very genial old gentleman, and cheerful, notwithstanding that Providence had been playing at Job with him with a vengeance of late. Not only was his party out of office, but everything had been going wrong with him, he said. A recent flight of locusts had devoured all his maize. A few days back, a jaguar had robbed him of a valuable horse, and now he had received very bad news indeed from his estate on the Rio Salado, 18 leagues to the eastward. The Indians had made a raid on his cattle there, driven off some hundreds of head, and lanced some of his peones. We were informed that we were the first foreigners that had visited this town, save one, and this latter was so pleased with it that he had taken up his residence there. What he found to be so pleased at, our informant could not tell us. Anyhow, this eccentric individual, on hearing that there were some European travelers in the pueblo, called upon us and welcomed us with great warmth. He proved to be an Italian, and according to his own account, a ne'er-do-weel who had tried many professions in his day. He was a garrulous yet solemn little fellow. He plucked us by the sleeve and rushed off into a detailed narrative of his former life in the true ancient mariner style. He had been for 18 years a soldier in Italy, then deserted. After this he was a sailor in the Spanish Navy for so long, deserted again. Next he became the husband of a shrew, deserted once more, and so on through a variety of professions, finishing off always with a desertion or abrupt running away. "And what are you now?" I inquired, imagining that he kept a little grog shop, was a cobbler, barber, or something of the like nature. But he gravely replied, "I am the government schoolmaster of the National School of Quebrachos." He was the village domine of this little hole in the desert, and was now seriously contemplating yet one more desertion from this not over-lucrative post. It rains but seldom in the central portions of the Argentine Republic, but when it does rain, it is to an English shower what the Niagara is to the falls of the Upper Serpentine. This night a fearful storm swept over the land, a hurricane of wind, terrible thunder, and such a deluge of water as quite accounted for the deep fissures and rents that cut the monte we had so recently traversed in all directions. The dogs of Quebrachos were as hospitable as the inhabitants, and not wanting in kind attention to the strangers. They came from the four corners of the square and mustered in front of the open doorway of the room in which we slept, to guard us through the perils of the night. They told themselves off in 2 watches, about 20 to each watch, and so relieved each other in the awful chorus which they kept up diligently till morning. When we rose at dawn, they came to us with 40 wagging tails, and looked up to our faces with self-satisfied looks, as if waiting for the thanks which were their due. We did not feel very grateful to them for their noisy guard, but assumed the virtue, though we had it not, and expressed to them our undying gratitude for their generous conduct. The officers of the guard dismissed the other dogs and consented to join us at breakfast over the remains of our sheep. Then, with expressions of mutual goodwill, we parted. March 26th. We did not set off very early this morning, but waited to see whether the weather would clear, for it still rained heavily. This, the autumnal, is the rainy season here. It is only during these months of February and March that there is any rainfall at all. When this fails, as not unfrequently happens, there is great distress in these provinces, and the cattle must either be driven eastward to the rivers by the Indian Chaco for pasture and water, or southward for sale. Our Italian acquaintance called on us at about 10 o'clock. He was a casual pedagogue, conducting his school on free and easy principles. He said, "I must now show you around the town. Besides, I want to have a chat with you about Europe. Come to the school with me and have maté." "I am afraid we will disturb you at your duties," I remarked. "My duties? Nonsense. I won't ring the bell for school as long as you were in Quebrachos. We'll give the urchins a holiday. Besides, I am tired of working for nothing. Can man work unless he be fed? Bueno, the provincial government have not paid me for 9 months. They will give me paper instead of salary. Paper will not buy bread." He showed me one of these despised bits of paper. He receives one each month, a large, elaborate, printed document gay with stamps and seals, an acknowledgment that the provincial government of Santiago del Estero owes him so many fuertes for a month's salary. In the original agreement with him, the government contracts to pay him his salary each month in gold or its equivalent in banknotes at the then rate of exchange. But these wretched IOUs, which the government will never redeem, which no storekeeper will take, utterly unnegotiable in short, are all the poor wretch is receiving. No wonder that he contemplates another desertion from such a thankless office. It suits the venal heads of the departments very well, in more than one way, that government debt should be paid in these IOUs, for the following trickery is notoriously practiced. The government employee, the poor ignorant holder of the paper, finding that he cannot cash it, that it is next to useless to him, will in many cases be only too willing to part with it at any sacrifice for a sum far below its nominal value. Then steps in a third party who buys the paper from him for a mere song, a speculator who has a brother or a brother-in-law or a cousin who is a compadre of some big man in office, or is possessed of some such backstairs key to that mysterious and abstraction for the unlearned, the government. This influence being brought to bear, the treasury winks and cashes the paper at its full nominal value, when the speculator, his relative, and the big man in office share the spoils and hold their tongues. Large fortunes have been acquired in this manner in this enlightened republic. Quebrachos is but a very small place, at the very outside possessing 20 houses and huts, and yet within these narrow limits we have 3 public houses, an imposing store where you can buy English pickles and beer, half a church, a school, a comandante, a judge, a schoolmaster, and an idiot beggar. A Santiagan settlement is like a San Dominican regiment, where all are officers and there are no privates. Or the old Falcon, where we had a self-dubbed admiral, a captain, a first lieutenant, a second lieutenant, and a crew composed of one small boy. Our friend the schoolmaster did, after all, summon his pupils before we left. Not to study, however, but to take a lesson in practical engineering. The flood of last night had invaded the schoolroom, and a bank of sand had formed outside the door, preventing the escape of water. So there was the good-natured pedagogue, bare-legged and in shirt-sleeves, spade in hand, directing a lot of half-naked, ragged, half-breed urchins to dig a canal through the sand into the square, so as to drain the flooded academy. We bid adieu to our kind hosts and rode off in a lull in the storm. It soon, however, broke on us again with all the fury of thunder and wind and rain. We were, of course, drenched in a very short time. Manuel utterly despised the rain, for, as he said, "See my coat, it is an English coat, and water cannot go through it, at least not much." He had evidently great faith in the tweed cutaway of the white man, and though he did become wet through as ourselves, he insisted that the water found its way only through the numerous rents of the old garment. The impenetrability of the material he never doubted for a moment. It rained so heavily that the sandy-floored Monte was soon covered with over 2 feet of foaming water. It thus became impossible to distinguish the track, but we followed the current of the waters, which we knew was in our direction, for the brown roaring flood was rushing into the north to swell the Rio Saladillo into wild crescentes with these millions and millions of tons of water. Water, difficult though it was to imagine, that would never reach the salt sea, but dry up beneath the hot sun in the vast Laguna de los Porongos, an inland sea in the desert that has no outlet to the ocean. From a balloon some 100 yards or so above, the whole plain we were now traversing would, I imagine, have presented the aspect of a shoreless, murky sea, with many bushes rising above its surface. We progressed with difficulty. Our horses became alarmed and stumbled continually in the rapid water, whose bottom they could not see. At times we suddenly found ourselves in holes where the whole of our saddles were under water, and the animals were carried off their legs by the rapid tide. Indeed, things looked far from pleasant, and, more or less lost as we were, there was a probability of night overtaking us while we were floundering about in the flood, a not agreeable prospect. Of a sudden the sky cleared and was blue again. The sun shone brightly and the birds burst into song. Lovely indeed this wild Monte now appeared. All the vegetation was fresh and dripping with diamond-like drops. The tropic evergreens were greener than ever after the welcome moisture. The huge cacti, 20 to 30 feet in height, were the chief feature in the landscape, pointing their gaunt arms, with their rectangular elbows, heavenward like some huge polypi, quaint and weird growths, very aged some of them, rotten and brown skeletons with all the outer green pulp long gone, lying on the ground, or standing only till the next strong wind blew them down. Beautiful convolvuli wound all around them, while air plants depended like hanging gardens from every branch with their delicate blossoms. Below, the yellow sands were hidden by the rushing waters, but the patches of golden blossoming chamomile rose like little islands here and there. At last, to our delight, we came across a hospitable house on a slight elevation overlooking the flooded land. On riding up, a gentleman came out with an unmistakable Teutonic cast of features. We introduced ourselves to him and craved hospitality for the night. He told us to off-saddle and enter within. We found ourselves, to our surprise, in a well-furnished room, with good engravings on the walls and a bookshelf full of standard German works. We seemed to have been transported of a sudden to Europe and civilization once again. Our host then, before making any further remarks to us, called the native handmaiden and ordered her to bring in some hot water and sugar. Then he opened a mysterious cupboard, full of curious instruments and bottles. From this he drew a decanter. Then, turning to us, he said in good English, deliberately and with pauses between the sentences, as he poured out with much delicacy and in exact proportions the contents of the decanter and hot water jug into 4 tumblers. "I, too, am a gringo, Dr. Scharn, a medical man in practice at Santiago. And now, as a doctor, I am going to prescribe for you after your wedding. Hot water and sugar, that is enough. Now, then, the rum. I think that's about the right dose. Come now, drink this down while it is hot." Bowing to his superior knowledge as to what was good for us, we swallowed the medicine heroically, and that too without making wry faces over it. We found the doctor to be a very well-informed man who spoke French, English, and Spanish as well as his native tongue. We were lucky in finding him on this country estate, where he was now passing a few weeks, a pleasant change after the sultry, unhealthy city of Santiago. We got all our clothes dry and enjoyed a deep sleep in beds for a change this night, for this was a very Capua. End of chapter 14.